Good morning, and welcome to Social Venture Partners Dallas. Thank you for joining our response segment, The Legislature Responds. Social Venture Partners Dallas is an organization of engaged men and women who give their time, talent, and financial resources to grow the capacity of social enterprises, provide educational opportunities on how to grow one's impact, and convene community-wide conversations and collectives for action. Before we introduce our panel today, I would like to thank our series sponsors, Forward DFW, Wright Knatzer Law Firm, and Something Good Consulting. Today's segment marks the 15th response session that SVP has provided for our community since the pandemic first started back in early March. We have had over 12,000 participants with us, and many of you in our audience today have been with us since the beginning. We thank you for your participation and efforts on behalf of our neighbors. We have intentionally kept these sessions free and open to all in our community. And so we are most grateful to the generous gifts that allow us to offer these sessions. We have had an extremely generous donor who will match any gift to SVP Dallas before year's end, up to $50,000. If you are able and find our work in the community worthy, please consider making a donation to these efforts so that we can meet that match before year's end. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome this panel. I welcome Margaret Spellings, who is the President and CEO of Texas 2036. And we are just so honored to have a woman of her stature and her experience with us today on the panel. I would also like to welcome Gromer Jeffers, who is a political reporter for the Dallas Morning News. I appreciate reading all of his columns and his work, and we are grateful to you for being with us today as well. We also welcome Evan Smith, who is the CEO of the Texas Tribune and who has become a great friend of Social Venture Partners Dallas, helped us with our Big Bang conference here just back in October, and has just been a really wonderful collaborator in our work, and we appreciate it so much. So to our panel, thank you so much for being with us today. You know, is really, Margaret comes out of a phone call that I received from Tom Luce, who is the founder of your organization. And when Tom calls, you just pay attention. And he said, Tony, you know, the Big Bang Conference and all this work that you all are doing and everything you're doing on the ground is really important and it's great work. But, you know, if you're not moving up from the ground and dealing with the Texas legislature, you're not going to have the impact that you need to have. So you better do a session on how to get involved in the Texas legislature. And of course, when Tom calls and tells you to do something, you just do it. So here we are because Tom called and told me. And Margaret, just thank you again to your team at your organization. What a fantastic job. And they just helped me pull this together. So I'm grateful to you and to them. But tell us a little bit about the mission of Texas 2036 and how members of our own local community can get involved in what your work is. And if you'll.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you for the great work that you all do here in this community. We, as I like to say, are trying to put the sensible center together to think long-term about the most important things in Texas. And I love the title of your session today, The Legislature Responds. God willing, that will be true. It's not always true. But what we need to do, and what you're doing by virtue of this session, is building civic demand for that response across these very biggest issues. And I'm sure we'll get into some of that today, but building civic demand to think long-term about the big stuff. That's what we're about. And as Tom likes to say, and as you reference in your little story, that progress happens when bottom up meets top down. And that's what we hope to set the table to do in more fulsome ways.
That is really fantastic. Thank you for being with us. Mr. Jeffers, I'm going to turn it to you for a second as well. You wrote recently along these lines that a group of Texas lawmakers has resurrected Caucus Foundation. Of course, our response series and a lot of our sessions have been around issues of race and the racial reckoning that we've gone through in the last several months. It's a nonprofit group that is now designed to provide research and policy analysis concerning issues that range from curbing police brutality to providing health care for the uninsured Tell us a little bit about the group and if you think any of their causes, the social justice causes that have been so important, as we talked about, as Margaret alluded to on the ground, if any of those are going to make it up to policy changes.
Yeah, Tony. Again, thanks for having me. Look, the Black Caucus Foundation first started in 1985 or so, and then it kind of went away, never really got off the ground. They're resurrecting it because some of the Black lawmakers in the Black Legislative Caucus, Harold Dutton out of Houston is president. They want a strong push for social justice issues, criminal justice issues, some of the issues that popped up in this summer of, of George Floyd and other incidents that created sort of an atmosphere where you can have a microscope or a mirror on some of these issues. And so they wanted to create a think tank and a foundation to help them in their efforts to push, like the George Floyd Act, that they will try to work on, the Botham Jean Act. He is the Black man who was killed here in Dallas by an off-duty police officer as she entered his apartment. She said she mistaked it for her own. And so they want a group that will be able to give them expert analysis and help them push in the legislature these issues. And we'll see if it works. Anytime you have a group that's sort of led by politicians, that in itself can be problematic, right? But so the goal is to keep the group professional, get them to provide analysis and research and the tools that these lawmakers need in the hearings and in the debate and when they're pushing these issues during the legislative session, to be able to have those resources necessary to make their case. And not just criminal justice, healthcare and other issues that affect communities of color as well. So we'll see if it works. Rudy Meteor, a gentleman, the councilman from Pflugerville, is the president and executive director. They're putting together their team now. It is a little late, but they hope that to be able to have this in place, not just for this session, but for sessions to come.
Thank you. Evan, welcome. Tell our audience a little bit about the Texas Tribune and what the mission is of the work you do through the Tribune.
Well, Tony, thank you so much for having me. And I am never sorry to be on a call like this one with your group. And of course, I love my friends, Margaret and Gromer. And so I'm happy to be with them as well. Look, the Texas Tribune has been in business now for a little bit more than 11 years. Election Day was our anniversary of our launch. We're a nonprofit digital news organization trying to amplify stories that are of interest to people all across Texas and in the realm of politics and public policy. That's what we do. We don't aspire to be the Dallas Morning News in the sense that it is a full service newspaper. And we, of course, love our friends there and want them to succeed. We also know that on the for-profit side of the media business, these are challenging times. There are many fewer venues for credible, reliable reporting, and many fewer reporters than there were a generation ago in Texas. But the problems of the state have gotten to be more complex. Population is growing very quickly and changing dynamically. And so we're a news organization for the purpose of providing information to people that is meaningful to them in their daily lives, allows them to be more thoughtful and productive citizens. We are about civic engagement, much as SVP Dallas and the events that you put on are ultimately about giving the community the means to be more involved in what's going on, to take ownership and agency of issues. That's what we do. And, heading into a legislative session, which is obviously critically important to all of us in Texas, we, fire up the engines and set out to tell people these are the big agenda items coming up and will be before the people we send to Austin, and then will come back to us in the form of laws passed and actions taken. This is a moment that we've never seen before, Tony. I know Gromer and Margaret would agree with this, where we've got an extraordinary public health emergency that is hardly past us. In fact, it's arguably worse today than it was back in March when we were all caught flat-footed by the arrival of this pandemic. We have an incredible economic downturn that, again, at least according to the national unemployment numbers that released today, is not getting better, but is getting worse. And we have a reckoning on race that is hardly a new issue, but has surfaced anew since the events of this summer. And, Gromer and I have both been in the journalism business a long time. If you're in this business for any period of time, you might get to cover one of those things in your lifetime. But the idea that we're having to pay attention from a journalism standpoint to those three things all at the same time, what a moment. And then heading into the legislature, you know, for this group of 181, we've just decided to send to Austin. They've got an extraordinary job in front of them, beginning with a not particularly good budget cycle that they've got to sort through. They've got redistricting that they've got to successfully deal with on a timetable probably a little later than normal because the census data is coming later. And then a whole host of issues like education and healthcare and the economic climate of the state. You know, how are we going to ensure that we have, as Margaret and her organization have talked about, a business climate and a workforce that is everything we want it to be as we move toward the bicentennial of Texas in 2036. So, you know, Tony, this is a hell of a time to be in the business that I'm in and that Gromer's in and that Margaret's in. I'm reminded of that old Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times, and interesting is both a blessing and a curse. Certainly in this case, interesting is both a blessing and a curse.
Margaret, tell us a little bit about, you know, the priorities for Texas 2036, because as Gromer has laid out, as Evan has laid out, there are so many organizations that have their specific priorities. There are so many serious issues. What are you hoping that you all will be able to raise to the level of having some action done?
Well, first, I want to say that we are unique as an organization in two ways. One, we are looking across the whole of government, these six most important things of health and education, justice and safety, government performance, infrastructure, natural resources, all those things that are really connected together, because we know, for example, that educated people are healthy people, and healthy people are educated people, and educated, healthy people start businesses and employ people, and the virtuous cycle that comes of all of that. So the other thing that really distinguishes us and is a place where we're in common cause with the organization that Gromer mentioned, and of course the Texas Tribune, with whom we partner on a lot of things, is data. We have curated and proffered more than 300 publicly available data sets across these most important things. They can be sliced and diced and analyzed at a local level, at a regional level, by sector, with through lines around equity, around rural issues, and around the needs of children. And I commend those tools to you, because the truth of the matter is our brand, Texas, is often better than what the facts might reveal when we look under the hood. We lead the nation in the number of uninsured adults and children. We have done some work in comparison with other states, 12 states, total 11 peers, where, for example, on third grade reading, we are 12 of 12 states. So we're trying to put the facts before the folks, especially our policymakers, to help them understand, you know, where should we make our first dollar investments? What must we do first? As Evan rightly said, this is going to be a challenging session in terms of the budget and the various needs and the logistical challenges and whatnot. So to answer your question, the priorities have to be around really several things. One, broadband. We have seen that we cannot have telehealth, e-learning, e-commerce without ubiquitous broadband and device capability. If we don't address those issues, our children will fall far behind, and it will be a very bode bad things for Texas and our future. Health and healthcare, obviously, very much prominent. What we are learning is that your neighbor's health matters to you. And we must address access to care, affordability of care, those things. Workforce. We have millions of Texans who are unemployed, who've lost their employer-based care, but also their JOB. And we have to figure out how we're going to retool that workforce. And as well, as Gromer rightly said, these chronic issues of justice and safety and equity. And may I say that while all of the things around policing and those, you know, point of the spear issues are important, if we don't address these systemic issues around education and health, we're going nowhere fast. And so those are the things we're going to be focusing on that will all culminate in the budget. There are two things the legislature has to do: pass a budget and redistrict themselves. And so I think rather than having a lot of pieces of legislation, we're going to see things manifest themselves through budget riders and using that vehicle. It's the one thing they have to get done, and I expect they will.
Tony, can I just piggyback on something Margaret said very quickly? This week, I interviewed a number of members of the House who are supportive of the incoming Speaker, Dade Phelan, to ask them, under this new leader and given the circumstances on the ground, what is this session going to be like? And Joe Moody of El Paso, who is a, by the standards of this current legislature, a veteran member, first elected back in 2008, and has been Speaker pro tempore of the House, was the vice chair of the Calendars Committee this time, and is one of the leading Democrats in a body that is majority Republican, but somebody who works with the other side. He said the way to think about this legislature is it's going to be a Texas recovery session. That is the agenda for this session, the Texas recovery. He said if you're not focused on the economic recovery or the healthcare recovery of this state, then you're not focused on the right things. And so I think the limited agenda of this session is going to be a really defining feature. That's not to say that people aren't going to try to put sharp objects on the table. After all, this is the Texas legislature. And you can also define recovery in different ways. Margaret's point about education being the through line for everything, I couldn't agree with more. We need an education recovery coming out of what's happened over the last 10 months. When you take a look at the challenges that some students and parents and families and communities and schools have had in making online education work, I think that's got to be part of the conversation. But look, in some ways, the agenda is wide open until it's set. But in some ways, sitting here, all of us today, we know exactly what this session is going to be about. Joe Moody is right. It's going to be about the recovery, about coming back.
And, and Evan, if I can just add also, it's similar, vastly different, but kind of similar to the previous session in the sense that everyone knew that they had to do something with education and how you were going to fund that. And that sort of set the tone for the entire session. You knew you had to get that done, and they were able to do it. But I think you're right. Going into this session, it's going to be about the recovery and those little sub issues you guys outlined. And we'll see if others will be able to put some grenades on the table as well. But I think they'll get those things done, or at least try to.
Ms. Spellings, go back and then talk about the data pieces. Like you talked about, the use of data, and you have these facts, and the facts are not the same as the PR machine about what Texas looks like. So it's a very interesting and valid point. But in our climate today, do you actually think anybody politically with political power is paying attention to actual facts?
Of course I do. And I think, it's incumbent upon us. This is what I mean when I say build civic demand. An informed populace really can help ask the right questions around the quality of our schools, or the quality of our health and whatnot. And I'll just use, health, Medicaid expansion, those are loaded words around the Texas legislature, but expanding access to care and affordability of care. I mean, those are things that people are open to talking about. How do we do a better job of drawing down federal dollars, particularly in these tight legislative budget times? So I think there's some open-mindedness around things. We don't have the luxury of pursuing, these more fringe issues, bathroom bills, and those sorts of things that people light on. We've got to get our work done this go round. We've got to balance a budget. We've got to address the needs in education and health, and all the supports around that. And so we at Texas 2036 have a strategic framework for Texas, 36 goals. We've done an assessment of where we are now, set some targets of where we think we can be in 16 years, and put some comparisons on the table about how we fare against other states. And it is very rich, data-informed work. And so far, it's been very well received by the legislature. They can't solve problems unless, we have made the case that they exist and they need a solution. And so the ostrich approach is over. Data-based solutions are what are fashionable in 2021.
Mr. Jeffers, you wrote a recent column about two U.S. representatives, Colin Allred and Van Taylor, and talked about they come from different sides of the aisle, but they work together on issues. Do you see much hope for the Texas legislature coming across the aisle, working together on issues? Is that a theme out there these days?
Yeah, if you talk to Van Taylor, who represents Collin County, he used to be in the House and the Senate in the Texas legislature. He uses the legislature as a model as what could occur in Washington, believe it or not. And you can imagine how folks think Washington is broken if they're using the Texas legislature as a model. But some former lawmakers who served in Texas and now serve in Washington say that the legislature is actually a better place to get things done and free of gridlock when you compare it to Congress. And so, it's hopeful that, look, you're a Republican and there are Republicans and Democrats, right? They're going to disagree on a lot of the issues that get ink, that get press coverage. But there are also issues like water and transportation and economic issues in Dallas, for instance. Taylor and Allward have districts that are next to each other. So they helped each other in terms of getting a Garland VA in Garland, the project to widen Central Expressway. They're working on that together. The bullet train from Dallas to Houston. They're working on those sorts of issues. And it's their hope that not only you can have that sort of approach in Washington, but in Austin as well. But let me just say this, in order for that to happen, I think the voters, the folks, have to really compel lawmakers to stop the shenanigans and get down to work. Allred is in the district that is home to George W. Bush, the former president. It's a swing district. It used to lean Republican not so long ago. Pete Sessions was the representative there. So he has to have a bipartisan approach in order to have political survival. Same in Collin County, which has been trending favorably for Democrats for years. It's not quite there yet. But if you're a Republican there, you got to be mindful that the demographics are changing there and you have to be a lawmaker for all the folks. So just as after the 2018 election, Texas lawmakers were compelled to work on things that mattered because they knew that the voters had spoken in 2018 and Democrats won 12 House seats during that cycle. And they got down to work. And so in my view, if the voters really say, hey, stop the nonsense, get down to work, then you'll see more lawmakers take that approach.
So, Evan, they obviously, reporters and news outlets have enormous power to get issues raised and to, people pay attention, right? When it's in print or it's on the television or whatever. But how do you see, what is the most effective way for ordinary citizens to get engaged and keep their folks accountable?
Well, let me first say that I do think there is power in the public's voice being heard and in the public expressing its voice to begin with. Gromer and Margaret have both said in different ways correctly that real change in states like Texas comes from the ground up, not the top down. And when the public demands something, when the public unites around an issue across communities, across geography, across ideologies, things get done. I'm thinking back to when the decision was made, and I know that Margaret has a strong point of view about this particular subject, when the decision was made to reduce the number of end of course exams, standardized testing a number of sessions ago. It happened because you had a massive number of people from around Texas effectively march up Congress Avenue with pitchforks and torches and storm the walls of the castle. That is an effective strategy as far as it goes. If you can galvanize public support or opposition on an issue, the legislature tends to listen. And I think it's difficult to ignore, again, Republicans and Democrats joining forces, which rarely happens. Margaret called out an issue earlier, Tony, that I think is, and Gromer did not name it in his list, although I thought his list was very good. But Margaret called out an issue earlier that I think may be that issue this session, and that is access to broadband. if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that we cannot allow for inequity of access to this thing that is effectively a lifeline for communities. You know, you wouldn't deny rural communities or Black or brown communities access to power or water, although sadly in the recent history of Texas, denying Hispanic communities along the border access to water is sort of a thing, incredibly. But nor should you deny those communities and other communities, every community, access to information. Broadband does become this, you know, lifeline on education in the middle of a situation like the one we're in right now, both for public ed and for higher ed. It becomes a lifeline, certainly for healthcare. We've had more rural hospitals closed in Texas over the last 10 years than have closed in any other state. And there was a rural healthcare crisis before the pandemic. There's a more significant crisis now, and telemedicine is often held up, as Margaret said, as the solution, but you can't have telemedicine without tele. And then, of course, economic development, which has always been a problem for rural communities. As people grow up and move away and don't come back to start businesses, you cannot start a business in a rural community if you don't have reliable access to broadband these days. And so there are a million reasons why this has to be an issue without partisanship. Everybody has to come together on that issue. So, you know, news organizations have a role to play. We can tee these things up. We are in the leading horses to water business, but we cannot be in the making them drink business. You know, Gromer's newspaper does editorials on issues and on candidates and campaigns, and God bless them for everything that they do. We go another way on that. We do not think our job is to tell people what to think. Our job is to tell people to think. Our job is to give people the means to be more thoughtful and productive citizens by giving them the inputs they need to produce outputs, whether outputs are in the form of votes at election time. And we had the most people turn out to vote this last election than we ever have in history in Texas. It may mean writing your legislator. It's not really going to mean going on knocking on legislators' doors this session, because we have this whole problem of not knowing what the access in a very literal sense to the Capitol and to the session is going to be. But it means writing and calling. It means writing and calling your congressman. It means being involved as issues get litigated in your community, whether about public education or anything else. That level of civic engagement is a critical element to the process of representative democracy. And so we in the news media have a role to play, and it is to tee these things up so that the public is aware that these issues are going on, that they know that the fights are going on, that they know that they have stakes in the outcomes of those fights. But at the end of the day, it's incumbent upon every one of us as Texans, as individuals, to take ownership of these issues. And, you know, to me, that's when the process works. And when the public checks out, legislators get to do what they want. And what they want is not always what the public wants. I'll leave you, Tony, on this answer with one observation. There are a handful of issues right now that in conservative states, conservative state leaders have refused to take up, saying all the while that they are refusing to take them up on behalf of their conservative voters, the people who put them in office. But at the same time, when those issues have gone to popular vote, when they've gotten on the ballot in November, the electorate actually has seen those issues differently. Whether it's marijuana reform or legalizing gambling or Medicaid expansion, just to name three. There are conservative states all over this country, as conservative as Texas, where state leaders have been resistant to reforms in those areas. But when the voters spoke, the voters had a very different point of view. The voices of voters, whether at the ballot box or marching up Congress Avenue with pitchforks, matter. Those voices matter. And that's how change happens.
Ms. Filings, pick up on that. You know, at Social Venture Partners, we regularly talk about how things get done, right? And things get done through organized people, organized dollars, organized ideas, right? And so your organization is organizing these things as well. What is the, so, you know, yes, writing to our legislators, calling them, all those kinds of things, but when we come together in some kind of organized fashion as a group and do it together, it seems to have more power. How do you all engage with citizens here in Dallas or across Texas to get your initiatives done?
Well, you know, we have to find the sensible center, and there are forums that I don't even say those words together because centrism is often out of fashion. But, you know, having worked at the federal and state level for a very long time, I know you have to work across the aisle and you have to find, you know, something for everybody. And that's why, Ted Kennedy and George Bush worked together to pass the massive, 87-10 in the US Senate law known as No Child Left Behind. And why I'm optimistic about things like broadband, because rural legislators where Republicans live, I think, we do have a major urban rural divide, are going to be highly attuned to and highly sensitive to those constituencies. We're one of only 6 states that don't have a broadband plan, and as such, it keeps us from maximizing federal support. There was a good announcement yesterday, but in urban areas, it's an issue around affordability. Often there's the capacity, but any of us who look at our internet bills know that it's often unaffordable. And so, where can the sensible center together come together to solve problems? I'm, as I say, optimistic around some of the health, access, and affordability issues. We know that the data tells us Texans of all kinds, with and without insurance, don't seek the care they need when they need it because of affordability. So how do we address that around transparency of pricing and the like? So I think with respect to the specific answer to your question, where's the deal? That's what we need to ask ourselves. How can we get this done, bringing people together? And I think government fails us when people go to their corners and we see entrenchment, often around things that in the giant scheme of things matter less to everyday Texans than things like health and schools and roads and water and the like. And I'll let you fill in your own list of what those might be. But we're seeing some of those emerge. Gromer writes about them and will.
Speaking of that, Mr. Jeffers, what do you write? What do you see as one of the central issues that people should be paying attention to?
Well, everything that's really been said. It's coming out of the pandemic, education, healthcare, and equity also, and for the communities that the need communities, the communities that really were hurting before the pandemic and are especially hurting now. I think it's going to be critically important to deal with the issues facing those communities, because when you talk about healthcare with the public at large, it's a problem. But in some communities of color, it's really a problem. And so as it relates to really making those communities whole, that's going to be really important. And let me just say, I agree with Evan on this about the public marching down Congress Avenue with their pitchforks and torches. But you can also march to your newspaper with pitchforks and torches, maybe not pitchforks and torches, but with your opinions and your views, and let us know what you're thinking. We have at the Dallas Morning News a sensational Austin bureau led by Robert Garrett.
Yes.
You see our stories there, our emails are there. Contact us, let us know what you're thinking, let us know what's important to you, because we like to feel like, and I know Evan feels the same way, that it's your newspaper, it's your media outlet.
Yep.
It's your media company as well. And we want to do this with you and just not dictate to you what's going on. So in a sense that we can have a collaborative approach, not just in government, but also in the way we frame these issues, I think that's important as well. But certainly we have to deal with education, healthcare, and the economy, not just in this session, but every session beyond that.
Tony, there's a big problem on education that I want to highlight that I know is no surprise to Gromer and no surprise to Margaret, and will be no surprise to people on this call. And that is that we budget every 2 years in Texas. We can only commit to something for a 2-year period, then we have to come back and redo it. In last session, finally, because rather than having courts put a gun to the head of the legislature, the voters in 2018 did, as has been alluded to, the legislature finally got its ass in gear and got school finance reform in place to the tune of $11.6 billion. That money runs out on August the 31st of next year. And, in that $11.6 billion, among other things, was an increase in pay for teachers and the funding of full day pre-K and an increase of the per student allotment for schools and school districts in Texas. If that 11.6 billion is not available to the legislature in the next budget cycle, 2-year cycle beginning September 1st, because the budget cycle is bad and there's less money available, then that represents a cut to teachers, a cut to families, and a cut to schools and school districts. So, I do think that coming into this session, look, pre-pandemic, there was already a discussion of whether this legislature could responsibly say with certainty that they were going to be able to find that 11.6 billion in the next budget. I think there's a bigger question now. And so, every issue is important, but every issue can't get equal attention at all times. And so, yes, the budget, Margaret said correctly, there are two things that the legislature is obligated to do constitutionally in this next session: pass a budget in balance and redraw district lines around legislative and congressional districts and state board of education districts. But beyond that, there are a whole bunch of issues that are serious hot potatoes. And compounding that fact is the fact that there aren't a lot of places to cut the budget. And so you can only go to the places where there's discretionary funding. And sadly, education funding in the state of Texas is discretionary.
Which is why, Tony, quickly, our ability to get more money from the feds for health and health supports is absolutely integral to whether we're going to meet the requirements enacted as part of the education reform. And I want to pick up on one thing that Gromer said also, and that is, this equity piece. Human capital is the #1 asset of Texas. It's why even a pandemic, people are still wanting to come here. And that means we have to do an infinitely better job of educating and providing health to our native population. We have enjoyed the Texas miracle because people from all over the country and all over the world have found Texas a magnet to do business. And our task will be to keep that business-friendly climate while doing a much, much better job around these human capital issues. And if and when we do, we'll lead the world. Yep. But we can do it. We're Texans.
And let me just say, Margaret, you mentioned healthcare and federal funds. So the Medicaid expansion deal has been on the table for a long time, and Governor Greg Abbott and the Republican-controlled legislature have said no to that deal. And Texas, the number of uninsured remains dramatically high. At some point, we're either going to have to take the deal, and the Democrats are going to push for that this session, probably unsuccessful. But if that doesn't happen, at some point, there has to be some sort of Texas conservative solution to how to get more people health insurance. And it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
And places like Indiana, where Mike Pence hails from, I have done that. And so, again, I think these things, this is why we have to look across the whole of government. It's going to be a fun and fascinating and exciting session. I'm looking forward to it.
Good.
Speaking, Evan alluded to this about the pandemic and how it's going to change interacting with the legislators. And Margaret, have you all changed your strategy for how to engage with the session this year based on the pandemic? And how are you approaching it?
And, as Evan said, we're not going to be, congregating in the lobby at the Capitol or driving to Austin as much. This is where relationships matter a whole lot. People who have staying power and relationships. We've built a 36-member board of Texans across party line, across our vast geography, men, women, et cetera, all professions represented. And so we'll be calling on our board and others to engage. It's all about relationships. So my advice to the folks on this call is make sure that you've got contact information and the sorts of things you're going to need so that you can engage throughout the session.
Thank you. Behind all of these issues, of course, are human beings, are people. And normally I would never do such a thing, Mr. Jeffers, but I have received a couple of texts from people who are in the audience that are very curious about the paintings and the portraits that are behind you. Would you take just a minute to tell our audience, let's do the human side here for a minute before we get back to issues. Tell us about the art behind you.
Oh, okay. Well, behind the painting is a painting of a blues musician. ZZ Hill, he's from Dallas, or was from Dallas, the late ZZ Hill. He recorded, he led a blues revival in the 1980s with his album Down Home Blues. And this is a painting I found of him at a bar called the Puffin Bar, a defunct bar in Dallas, Texas. And it was a street artist who did a painting, and I found it and I bought it. And next to him is Charlie Parker, the great jazz musician from the 30s and 40s, behind the bebop era. And above that is one of my heroes. Well, I wouldn't call her, but Rita Hayworth, and I have her. This is Gilda, the movie with Glenn Ford. And the reason I have that up there is because of Alzheimer's, and I had family members who had Alzheimer's, and her fight really brought a worldwide focus to the disease at a time when no one really knew a lot about it. So that's what I have on my wall.
Can I just say, I love Gromer Jeffers so much. There are very few people in this state in journalism who are as interesting as Gromer, man. That's great. I love.
Thanks, Evan.
Gromer, I appreciate you sharing that with us, but it does also highlight a area of, just has been hit so hard. You mentioned the jazz clubs, and so we have the restaurant industry that's been decimated. We have the arts that have just been hit so hard. Is there any hope out there? Are these conversations even being taken up for funding to these folks who have been just hit so hard that you are aware of?
Gromer, I'm not aware of any conversation happening in the legislature that's similar to the one happening at the federal level, which, by the way, doesn't seem to be going anywhere, about spending money to save businesses, right? I'm not aware of any state version of that.
I'm not either, Evan, and it's so important. I mean, there are a lot of businesses that are falling in the cracks because of this pandemic, and little spots like little clubs and places to go after work, have a cocktail or whatever your drink of choice is, and watch the traffic die down and before you get home or whatever. And it's one of the things I miss about this year in terms of covering politics. Evan, you can appreciate this, and Margaret as well. I mean, who is the interaction with people and voters, and to be able to get off work or leave a rally and just go unwind at an establishment and talk to real people and talk to strangers and get to know strangers is really something that I've missed. And yeah, you're right. There's not a lot of talk about that, but hopefully we can get some focus on those businesses. There's a place in North Oak Cliff in Dallas called Tiny Victories. It's a small cocktail bar that opened just before the pandemic, several months before the pandemic, and was doing quite well. And I don't think has been able to open up again because it's just a straight bar, right? No food, nothing like that. But people would congregate and get old-fashioned cocktails, Negronis and old fashions and Manhattans. And that place hasn't been able to open since then. So hopefully we'll find a solution and a vaccine, if it works, maybe that'll help as well.
Gromer makes a really important point about the value of those casual interactions that we took for granted before. In my version of that, because I hate everybody and I don't go to bars and stuff like that, but my version of that, my version of that is that I used to travel all the time, and I'd be in airports all over the state and all over the country, and I'd be in boarding lines or in gate areas. And I would run into people I knew and people I didn't know. And that became a persistent focus group. What's on people's minds? What are you thinking about? What do you care about? What are the issues that are that should be on our minds? I mean, it gets back to the question that Tony asked Gromer about the role of the media in helping to set an agenda or to curate an agenda or to collect public feedback and to advance the progress of an issue. Those conversations have largely gone to nil right now as we all sit in our houses, on Zoom or on Slack, going slowly crazy. or quickly crazy in my case. I mean, I think that's the thing that's lost. And I know that we're going to get out of this at some point. Better days are ahead. And I share your view that the vaccine can't come soon enough, but it's a real missed opportunity over these months to understand what regular people in this state are thinking about the issues that affect their lives. It's something that we really do lack right now.
Yeah.
I just want to add one quick thing to what Gromer said, because those places really need our support right now, and through various sites and various funding. And one of the things that brought me back to Texas was our philanthropy, and the philanthropic community that we have in Texas is stronger than anything I've seen anywhere. And with the markets roaring and rich people getting richer, it's time for us to step up and help save these small businesses, and GoFundMe or whatever ways you can do it, because we need them. So that
we have Gromer, you'll confirm this. I think we have about $3 billion in CARES Act money left over that we have to spend by the end of the year, don't we?
Something to that effect. I mean, if you believe it, right? I mean,
right.
But yeah, and I think that's what's been frustrating to some people, is that you had the initial CARES Act and what followed, and then everything just stopped as we got closer to the election. And hopefully they can come up with some sort of deal before year's end, and to help some folks.
Margaret, excuse me, Gromer.
Go ahead, Tony.
I want to go back to you, Margaret, first of all, and I want to publicly thank you for your many years of public service. It's remarkable to have someone of your expertise visiting with our audience today. So thank you very much, Ms. Spellings, for all of your service to our community at the state level and the federal level, and now the work that you're doing. And with all of that experience, and given the times and kind of the silliness that sometimes we see our public leaders displaying, you still seem to have some optimism and you have some hope. Tell us a little bit about where that's coming from, and why you see that, and how we can all participate.
I do. I mean, I think the public is way ahead of our policymakers. I mean, nobody I'm talking to says, please, Ken Paxton, go sue go get with a bunch of states and try to overturn the presidential election, for God's sake. People are thinking, where is my broadband? Can my kid get a job? How am I going to pay for college? And so I'm optimistic, because I think the public is ahead of our policymakers. And I think when we get ourselves organized, go tell our story, knock on the door, they respond. I mean, we went from a legislature that was dominated the national news about bathrooms into virtually unanimous support for major investments in education. They heard that people care about the big stuff. And so I think all of us are in the building civic demand business, and the public is ahead of us. And I think, frankly, a lot of policymakers are starving for somebody to help them do the right thing, to keep their fringes at bay, and to come to solutions.
You brought up the role of the philanthropy plays, and of course, Social Venture Partners sits in the middle of all of that. And one of the critiques of philanthropy is that we are not having the effect that we should have, particularly around equity issues. And one of the things that we really understand is that philanthropy has got to be involved with public policy if these issues are really going to have an impact and change. We have family foundation representatives in our audience. We have community foundations in our audience. What is your recommendation for philanthropy getting involved with public policy?
Well, go ahead, Margaret. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to answer quickly and say, look at the data. When the state and philanthropy and local investors are working together, pulling in the same direction around goals like broadband or reading or, poverty or homelessness or hunger or whatever, we're all in better shape. And so having that connectedness is important. When I worked for then Governor Bush, Laura Bush led a whole effort where we brought all the philanthropies together working on reading and education. So we would at least compare notes. And I know a lot of that goes on informally, but we're eager for you all to use our data to inform that work, and really commend that approach.
This is the most important thing that we could be talking about, Tony. Seriously, the role that philanthropy has played, is playing, and has been forced to play in the absence of action by people who we had turned to in previous lives to solve the problems of our communities and of our country. The government has gotten out of the business of solving problems largely. I know that's an exaggeration, but it's an exaggeration for effect. It also happens to be mostly true. And the private markets are risk averse, generally speaking. And so philanthropy runs up the middle of the field. We have big problems that need to be solved. Philanthropy has the capacity and the inclination along the risk reward continuum to make bets that they know may not pay off in service to the potential for greatness. And so because we don't have these traditional means to solve big problems, philanthropy has to save us. And so in Texas, we turn to the likes of the Meadows Foundation and the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. We turn to Houston Endowment. We turn to the Communities Foundation of Texas. We turn to Arnold Ventures. We turn to many of the big institutional philanthropies, along with smaller ones and family offices. We have more rich people in Texas, as Margaret correctly said. The rich have gotten richer here and elsewhere. We have more people on the Forbes 400 in Texas than from any other state. We have the capacity to solve these problems. And fortunately, philanthropy has the inclination to play a role. And they are playing a role, and a role that is so significant that were it not for the work of those institutions and individuals and others, I'm not sure that we would be able to solve the problems we have in front of us right now. So it's not a question of whether philanthropy can get involved with public policy. It's thank God they have gotten involved, because where would we be if they hadn't?
Thank you. Gromer, you're on the ground in Dallas. Do you have a message for philanthropy here locally? What would you like to see the organized philanthropic dollars get engaged in? You're still on mute, buddy.
Some of the issues that we talked about, access to broadband, poverty. One of the disturbing problems that we're coming up against is that renters are about the moratorium or the prohibition against evictions is about to expire, that I believe the CDC had put forward. Later this month, that's all going away unless someone does something. There will be people in need of rental assistance or assistance to just to stay in their homes. That's going to be a big problem unless someone does something about it. And by the way, let me just make a correction. Charlie Parker's over here. That's Thurgood Marshall and Duke Ellington behind me. All right.
Thank you. Just a quick comment. I don't read much about the Texas Rainy Day Fund. What's happening with that? Is it going to be in play?
$10 billion in it right now.
Yeah.
And
it's pouring. It's not just raining.
Right.
Pouring.
I suspect that yeah, it will come into play. I mean, if I had to look into my crystal ball, I think the gap for this biennium will not be that overcomable. Somewhere in the $2 to $4 billion range. There's $10 billion in the rainy day fund. And so I'm optimistic about closing whatever budget gaps we're going to have in the short run. And obviously the storm clouds in the offing around the future is what's most concerning, and why we need to wear masks everywhere, every day, always.
I don't know, Evan, do you think they use it? Because they've been resistant for so long.
Well, there are the process pieces of this that you got to get 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to agree on something, and those guys can't agree on half a ham sandwich, right? But look, I mean, I think the economic crisis ramps up the pressure on these guys, turns the volume up to 11, as they said in Spinal Tap, to dip into that for purposes that are aligned with the one-time expense goal here. Because it has to be a one-time expense, right? That's either the rule or that's the tradition of the use of the rainy day fund. I think remember the old John McCain line that it's always darkest before it gets really dark. I think that what's happening here is that we're going to get into a session where it's going to get really dark, but it's not as dark as it's actually going to get. And they may have no choice. Their backs may be against the wall. I mean, I'll go back to what I said about the $11.6 billion for education. If you don't find that money or most of that money, you're cutting teacher pay, you're sticking families with an inability to put their kids in full day pre-K, and you're cutting the amount of spending per student, which is exactly the opposite of the goal of this legislature in the last session and the opposite of what the public demanded in the 2018 elections. So if there's some way that the legislature could draw down money from the rainy day fund to at least plug the dike on some of that stuff, I think it's possible, right? I think it's possible.
In extraordinary times that people understand are unique. So again, maybe I'm the rose-colored glasses member of the panel, but
No,
we're going to have a cocktail together, Gromer, when this is all over in person and compare notes about
At tiny victories, hopefully, right?
that'd be great.
So we have just a minute or two left, and as we mentioned earlier, behind all of these really important issues are real human beings, real people, and real people are suffering, and people have been changed, and there have been great loss, but we're looking to the future. And Margaret, if you just take a minute and share with our audience, maybe personally, how you've been changed or your thinking has been changed over the events of the last several months.
Well, like Gromer and Evan, I so miss just being with strangers and how about them Cowboys? What about this weather? Have you had a pumpkin spice latte yet? Or, just those small human interactions that we all crave and that we miss. And I guess what I've learned is I'm not going to take those for granted anymore, and really appreciate them going forward. And I hope it'll be pretty soon.
For sure. Thank you. Evan, how about you?
I have come to embrace even more fully than before the pandemic the importance of empathy, understanding, and compassion to other people, because everybody else's situation is not your situation. We have been very fortunate in my household to get through this 10 months relatively sane and healthy. We have been held it together in all ways that you measure the health and success of your life. And we don't take that for granted. Margaret is absolutely right. Do not take anything for granted if we've learned anything in the last 10 months. But I want to tell you that it's caused me to really look hard within myself and ask myself what I want to be doing with my life, right? Not to get super metaphysical here or existential, but if you're fortunate to come out of this period of time whole, you've dodged a bullet in a big way, and you don't know how much time you have left ever. And you don't know if something else unexpected is going to befall you the way that this befell us. And so I think for a lot of us, it certainly has for me, caused a lot of self-reflection. And, I am mostly, Tony, coming out of this sad. I'm coming out of this sad about the world, sad about the impact of this pandemic on people. And I wish that I could personally do more. So again, I come back to what I said at the beginning: empathy, understanding, and compassion. Thank you.
Mr. Jeffers, how about you?
Yeah, I echo what Evan and Margaret has said. I'm grateful that I'm still able to do what I was doing before the pandemic, that I'm doing it now. It's not lost on me that I'm fortunate and lucky to some extent to be able, just to the basics, to be able to feed myself and have a place to stay. There's some folks that don't have that. And so I'm grateful that, you had to take a pay cut here and there, but so what? I'm still able to do what the job I love, writing about politics. And so I'm grateful. And like Evan, a little sad that there are people out there who are still suffering. The loss of life is just devastating. And it's kind of hard. I wouldn't say you feel guilty about it, but you feel just sad that in many cases, people went through things, and maybe if there had been a different approach to this pandemic, not criticize. Look, it's a pandemic, right? You're gonna have some things occur, but on one level, it seems like, I mean, we're arguing over wearing masks or social distancing and things like that. And to me, that's kind of sad and unfortunate. But I'm also hopeful that we can come out of this and sort of learn the lessons of the past few months and maybe come out of this in a better place ultimately. And it's going to take some time, but maybe ultimately come out of this and be better for it. And that's the great hope. And that we'll all see each other again. And when we see each other again, when we're able to touch each other and give each other hugs again, if that ever happens, that everybody will be in a better place.
Well, I thank each of you. I want to express our deepest gratitude and the audience's appreciation for your wisdom and your knowledge that you share, and for all the work.
Tony, what about you?
Again, you know, I resonate with each one of you, every one of you, and everything that you've said there. The losses are overwhelming, and I know that there will be a public reckoning with grief that we all have to go through in order to get on the other side. But what I am so impressed with, you know, the fact that so many people just like yourselves, who are in extraordinarily powerful roles and have accomplished great things, your generosity of spirit, the panels that we have had, the people that I've called and asked, will you come and share your insights and your wisdom? Yes, yes, yes. It has been extraordinary how generous people are during this time, with not only their financial support, but with their time and with sharing their wisdom. So I am very grateful. I come out of this with much gratitude for you all and for all of the panelists that have been on any one of our sessions. I am most grateful to my small and mighty team at Social Venture Partners for producing these kinds of offerings, to our board of directors, who really are the foundation of any great organization. And I just want to thank our audience for sticking with us. If you are celebrating Hanukkah, which starts this evening, many blessings to you and your family. We will be offering a deeper dive into the nuts and bolts of this with my colleague Prisma Garcia, leading a conversation next Tuesday. You can see our website on that at noon for how to engage with the Texas legislature, nuts and bolts wise, with people who are doing it every day. So if you want a deeper dive, join that session. And I will be back in January with our next Respond series. And hopefully we can close a chapter on this door, but we can all come out of this with a new light and a renewed hope. And so once again, thank you to each and every one of you, and to our audience, and blessings for a wonderful holiday season and a great new year ahead. Take care, folks.
Thanks, Tony.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thank you, Tony.
everyone.
Bye.